Good evening, everyone. Boa noite. My name is Marco Schaumloeffel. I teach Portuguese. I'm lecturer at the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. Welcome back to our series, Brazil, 200 Years of Independence, History, Language, and Culture. Today is actually a holiday in Brazil. It's September the 7th and is Independence Day. So we have a special session here. As you know, usually we meet on Thursdays, but today, exceptionally, we meet on Independence Day. And the person that was supposed to present today, unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, cannot present today. So at last minute, but they may present perhaps later at some point in September or October, we will see. So at the last minute, I decided to make a selection of short videos that are related to Brazil's independence. And the way we will operate today is we will play those videos, so you will learn a few things. So you will learn that independence is not just the 7th of September, that's it. You will learn that it was a period that led to independence before, and independence was not fully completed after on September the 7th, 1822. But it took some time after as well. So I hope we can learn this. And we will play those videos, and once a video is played, you can ask a question or make a comment if you want. If there are no questions or no comments, we will proceed and play the next video, okay? So I guess you can hear me well. I will now start the first video. I produced a page called on my website. It's just my surname.net/Brazilian culture. You can use this later if you want. And I made a list of different videos we will watch. And the first one, to put everything in perspective, there was a whole wave of independences going on in South America. And this is a brief history of South America year after year that shows you how South America came into being as it is known today. So let's watch this short video first. So you can see the Caribs and the Arawaks were there as well in the north of South America, as you can see, right? The ethnic groups that are known in the Caribbean mostly. And you see the years passing by at the right bottom. So 1500 is going to probably, so to say, start when you are Okay, so as you see, we still have French Guiana that is not independent, and we also have the Falklands or Ilias Malvinas that are not independent. They still are colonies in South America. So perhaps this history will continue developing. Any comments? Any questions? No? Okay. Then we will go on and we'll see now exactly the independence movements in Latin America.
This is a map of what the Americas looked like at around the year 1750. And as you can see, it was for the most part divided as colonies by a bunch of European powers. Most prominent is Spain. You can see in this peach brownish color. It had control all the way as south as modern-day Chile and Argentina, and all the way as far north as modern-day Texas and California. You also see significant control by the Portuguese in what will eventually be Brazil. The French have, at this point, some territory, especially in North America and in several islands in the Caribbean. And the British, of course, have control along the east coast of North America. And they also have several islands in the Caribbean and the Atlantic. As we fast forward 100 years, we're going to see a dramatic change. Notice, roughly 100 years later, most of what used to be these European colonies have now achieved independence. In other videos, we go in some depth from 1776 to 1783. You have the American War for Independence. You see on this map now, the United States is an independent country. From 1791 to 1804, you have Toussaint Louverture lead the revolt against French control, eventually gaining independence and establishing Haiti. From 1807 to 1830, you have a series of revolutions in Latin America, many of which were led by Simón Bolívar, who was a criollo, or Creole, Venezuelan. The term Creole has many meanings in modern-day language, but in this context it refers to someone of mostly Spanish descent who was born in the New World. And Simón Bolívar plays an active role in achieving independence from Spain for Venezuela, what will eventually be Colombia and Panama, Ecuador, Peru, and the country that will eventually be named for him, Bolivia. So there is an interesting question here. What led to all of these revolutions? The map that I showed you before, that colonial map of the Americas, these colonies had been in place for several hundred years before these revolutions. Why did all of these revolutions happen roughly at the same time? Well, one overarching idea is that as we enter into the 1700s, you have the intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment. There were many authors and many publications involved in the Enlightenment, but perhaps most famous is the Encyclopédie in French, or encyclopedia, which had the intent of collecting much of the scientific and political science knowledge of the time. And it's considered one of the central texts of the Enlightenment, and it was a series of articles published from the 1750s all the way until the 1770s. And to get a sense of it, here is an excerpt of an article by one of the authors, Denis Diderot, considered one of the primary actors in the Enlightenment. No man has received from nature the right to command others. Liberty is a gift from heaven, and each individual of the same species has the right to enjoy it as soon as he enjoys the use of reason. And so when we get into the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson, he borrows heavily from these ideas of the Enlightenment. Now, the Haitian Revolution was partially inspired by these ideas of the Enlightenment, but they were also helped by the fact that France was undergoing its own revolution at the time, and it was not in the position to exert strong control over a far-flung colony. The French Revolution lasts from 1789 to 1799, at which point Napoleon Bonaparte takes control of France and starts the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon tries to keep control, what would eventually be Haiti, was an incredibly valuable resource. It produced a good chunk of coffee and sugar in the world. It was incredibly profitable for the plantation owners and for France as a nation. But between the ideas of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, the slaves of Haiti, led initially by Toussaint Louverture, were able to overthrow and set up their own nation, which is the first time that this has happened from a successful slave revolt. This is a map of the empire that Napoleon establishes at its peak. And as you can see, you see France, but he's able to take over much of modern-day Germany, Italy. He goes to war with Portugal and then eventually Spain as well, both significant colonial powers in South America. So it's in this context. You have the Enlightenment as we get into the 1700s. You already have the example of the American War for Independence, 13 colonies being able to declare independence from one of the largest powers at the time. Then a successful slave revolt to establish their own country against another significant power. And once Spain and Portugal are fighting Napoleon, coupled with the ideas of the Enlightenment and the examples of the United States and Haiti, it inspires a whole other series of revolts in Latin America, many of which were led by Simón Bolívar. And so by the time we get to 1850, much of the European imperialism in the Americas has come to an end.
Okay, so any comments, any questions here?
We begin in 1763. Almost the entire American continent.
Any questions?
No.
No. Okay, so then let's go ahead and go to Brazil.
Brazil's National Day is September the 7th. It marks Brazil's declaration of independence from Portugal in 1822. Let's take a look at the history of this holiday. Brazil had been a colony of Portugal since the 16th century. In 1807, France invaded Portugal and the Portuguese royal family escaped to Brazil. In 1815, Brazil was given equal kingdom status with Portugal. By 1820, the French had withdrawn from Portugal, and the Liberal Revolution resulted in the return of the Portuguese court to Portugal from Brazil in 1821. King João VI returned to Lisbon, leaving his 23-year-old son, Pedro de Alcântara, as regent of the Kingdom of Brazil. On September the 7th, 1822, a declaration of independence from Portugal was made by Alcântara. Alcântara, better known as Dom Pedro I, became the first Emperor of Brazil, ruling from 1823 until 1831. To mark the National Day of Brazil, here are some interesting facts about Brazil. The name Brazil comes from the Portuguese name for a tree common in Brazil from which a red dye was obtained. Brazil is the 5th largest country in the world. It makes up 47% of the landmass of South America. Brazil has the largest population of Catholics in the world, at 123 million. The capital, Brasilia, looks like an aeroplane when viewed from above. Rio de Janeiro means January River. Mistakenly, a Portuguese explorer thought the bay was the mouth of a river. The Amazon River is the world's largest by volume of water discharged, more than the next 7 largest rivers combined. There is a Brazilian island that has 5 snakes per square meter. The national animal of Brazil is the jaguar. Brazil has more than 4,000 airports. That's more than any other country other than the United States. A soccer stadium in Brazil has the halfway line on the Earth's equator, so each team defends a different hemisphere. In 1808, Rio de Janeiro became the capital of Portugal, making it the only European capital ever to be outside Europe. 3 of the 5 wealthiest people in Brazil earned their fortunes from beer. Brazil has been the world's largest exporter of coffee for more than 150 years. Though surprisingly, Bolivia exports more Brazil nuts than Brazil.
Bolivia exports more Brazil nuts than Brazil. So obviously because a lot of the Brazil nuts is internal consumption in Brazil. Any questions, any comments? Obviously those last facts are just curiosities. They're not related to the independence, but still are interesting. If there are no comments, now there is another interesting video. This is in Portuguese, and it's about the participation of women and of the people in general in independence. It is in Portuguese. So I beg
Bicentenário da Independência.
for your understanding, just a second,
Bicentenário da Independência.
because it is in Portuguese and the only thing available here is automatic translation. And as you know, automatic translation is not perfect, but it helps somehow to give away the content. So I will set up the English automatic translation. So bear in mind, this is not perfect, but it gives you most of the content correctly. Let's play.
Bicentenário da Independência do Brasil. Tem 2 mitos que estão nesse processo e nesse vídeo eu vou quebrar esses 2 mitos. Continua aqui comigo que você vai saber quais são. E antes disso, não se esqueça de se inscrever aqui no canal, ativar o sininho para você não perder nenhum conteúdo que a gente faz para você. Bom, os mitos são o seguinte. Primeiro, o povo não participou da independência do Brasil. Esse é o primeiro. O segundo mito é: só homens fizeram a independência do Brasil. Bom, primeiro vem aqui comigo. O processo de independência do Brasil, ele não se deu no dia 7 de setembro de 1822. Tem um processo histórico anterior que vai explicar como a gente chegou no 7 de setembro. Só que acontece que a independência também não acabou no 7 de setembro. Depois do 7 de setembro, muitos outros processos aconteceram e a gente chama isso de guerras de independência. A mais marcante delas é a Bahia, a independência da Bahia.
E é esse caso que eu vou usar para desmistificar os 2 mitos que citei lá no começo do vídeo.
Na Bahia, a gente teve uma revolta popular muito forte, porque os portugueses da Bahia, principalmente em Salvador, não queriam seguir a independência. Eles queriam continuar seguindo as cortes de Lisboa e impedir a emancipação do Brasil. Então, lá na Bahia, o povo e várias classes sociais, então negros, forros, ex-escravos, mulheres, indígenas, pequenos comerciantes e até a aristocracia, todos juntos participaram da luta contra os portugueses. Essa é a primeira questão. Então, o povo participa do processo de emancipação. Isso que aconteceu na Bahia também aconteceu na Cisplatina, aconteceu no Piauí, aconteceu no Mato Grosso e em outros estados. Então, você pode escrever aí, a participação popular foi fundamental para consolidar o 7 de setembro. O segundo mito, mulheres não participaram da independência. Ora, pois, você acha que é só aquele dia lá, o Dom Pedro falando independência ou morte em cima do seu cavalo, aquele quadro do Pedro Américo resume a independência? Não. E, de novo, a Bahia está aí para mostrar para a gente que as mulheres participaram. É claro que não era fácil para as mulheres participarem. Por exemplo, elas eram proibidas de entrar no exército que combatia os portugueses. E por isso Maria Quitéria, a grande Maria Quitéria, se vestiu de homem, cortou os cabelos, emprestou o nome do seu cunhado e ela se alistou no exército chamado de Periquitos. Era o apelido que se dava para o exército naquele momento por conta das cores que foram utilizadas pelos combatentes. Outra mulher também era Maria Filipa. Mulher negra e liberta, vivia na ilha de Taparica, liderou mais de 40 mulheres para que os portugueses não invadissem o recôncavo baiano. Outra mulher também foi a Joana Angélica. Essa era uma madre que protegeu um convento da Lapa da invasão dos portugueses. Os portugueses queriam entrar lá para ver se tinha algum combatente escondido. Joana Angélica protegeu o convento da Lapa, foi morta naquele momento. Virou um ícone na cidade de Salvador. E para a gente fechar a história dessas várias mulheres que participaram na independência, eu quero lembrar de ninguém mais, ninguém menos, de que Leopoldina. Porque na prática, gente, quem assinou o decreto de independência do Brasil no dia 2 de setembro de 1822 foi a Leopoldina. Por quê? Porque ela estava como princesa regente numa viagem do Dom Pedro. Então, Dom Pedro estava viajando, estava em São Paulo, e lá no Rio de Janeiro, a Leopoldina, ela estava como princesa regente. E foi ela que, numa reunião do Conselho de Estado, assinou a Declaração da Independência. Claro que ela teve que mandar uma cartinha para o Dom Pedro, para que o Dom Pedro pudesse legitimar o decreto dela. Então, veja, as mulheres participaram bastante, mas foi muito difícil que elas tivessem as suas ações reconhecidas. Como eu falei, Maria Quitéria teve que se vestir de homem e Leopoldina teve que pedir para o seu marido endossar aquele decreto que ela mesma estava assinando. Então, gente, para a gente fechar aqui, povo participou, mulheres participaram da independência, aquela história do quadro, do Grito do Ipiranga, do Pedro Américo, é um jeito de ver a história. E a gente precisa rever esse jeito, porque afinal de contas a gente está no século XXI. E no século XXI, a história tem cada vez mais trazido outras histórias, outros personagens que também fizeram a história do nosso país. Essa é mais uma forma da gente interpretar o bicentenário da independência. E se você quiser saber mais, não deixe de acompanhar aqui o canal que está cheio de conteúdo para você. Vem ser coruja, até a próxima dica, tchau!
Okay, any comments, any questions? If not, now a summary of Brazil independence in 3 minutes.
During the Napoleonic Wars, the British helped the Portuguese royal family escape Europe and set up court in Brazil. But after the wars had finished, King John VI did not return to Portugal straight away. This is because he believed his presence in Brazil stopped any independence movements like the ones that were happening in Spanish America. Brazil was then raised to an equal partner in the empire, forming the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil and the Algarves, and they had expanded Brazil by invading modern-day Uruguay in 1816. Meanwhile, Portugal was largely governed by the British, who remained there after the Napoleonic Wars under William Carl Beresford. This angered the population in Portugal and reduced Portugal to sort of a colony. So the people rebelled, and the Liberal Revolution of 1820 captured the major cities and set up a Cortes, an assembly of the nobility and important individuals. They demanded John return to Portugal, which he did so in 1822, and he promised to uphold the new constitution that they had created. He left his son Pedro to rule in his place in Brazil, but the Cortes also reduced his role as the Prince of Brazil. Brazil would not only just be made a colony again, but all provisional governments would be subordinates of Portugal, essentially breaking up Brazil, and they could only trade with Portugal once again. Plus, using the army, Jorge de Aviles had sent an ultimatum to Pedro, telling him to go back to Portugal and swear to uphold the constitution. Pedro initially agreed to do so, but many, notably José Bonifacio de Andrade, convinced him to stay. So Aviles again mutinied in early 1822. But this time thousands of civilians and police surrounded his troops, and he was deported to Portugal. Bonifacio was made a minister and mentored the young prince. But to appease the liberals, he agreed to have a constituent assembly and signed a decree calling for elections of deputies. And Bonifacio convinced Pedro to travel around the country to gain support, especially after the attempted mutinies. Pedro made it to Sao Paulo in late August 22, and there was still no major call for independence from him or Bonifacio at this point. But then he got news that the Cortes in Portugal wanted to remove all of his remaining powers and abolish all reforms his government had made so far. On hearing this in front of his guard of honor, Pedro declared independence and travelled back to Rio. That same month he took the title Emperor, but would rule according to the constitution, and Brazil separated from Portugal, ending 300 years of colonial rule. However, especially up in the north, some still remained loyal to the Portuguese, and the Portuguese still had a sizable army stationed in ports and forts like Belém, Montevideo, Salvador and São Luís. To increase the number in their armies, both nations used slaves, forced recruitment and foreign mercenaries. The Brazilians did have more men, but in the first major battle in March 1823, they were poorly equipped and promptly crushed. And when they tried to besiege Salvador, the Portuguese just sent thousands of reinforcements by sea, as they had a much larger navy. However, to build a navy, the Brazilians bought boats and recruited sailors from Britain, notably Thomas Cochrane. And when the Portuguese encountered Cochrane's fleet, they retreated into Salvador's port instead of fighting, and were then blockaded within the city. Then, pretending that there was a huge fleet on its way, Cochrane managed to get the Portuguese in São Luís to surrender without putting up a fight, and the same happened in Belém. The blockaded Portuguese then surrendered in Salvador in July, meaning the Portuguese had surrendered all of their territory except Montevideo. Meanwhile, in Portugal, King John VI's other son Miguel led a coup and forced his father to abolish the constitution. So with Portugal descending into civil war and unable to send reinforcements, the Portuguese finally surrendered Montevideo and made peace in 1824. And in Brazil, Pedro dismissed Bonifacio, and after months of debate over the constitution, he sent troops into the Constituent Assembly and dissolved it. But the new highly centralized government angered those in the northeast, and they tried to secede and form the Confederation of the Equator a year later. Plus, in modern-day Uruguay, separatists rose up, and this triggered a war with Argentina. And Pedro would not reign for long. He abdicated the throne and travelled to Portugal to claim the throne when his father died. His young son became Emperor of Brazil, but Pedro would have to fight his brother for the crown of Portugal during the Liberal Wars.
So I think the interesting message here is that the Portuguese somehow in certain areas of Brazil resisted independence. So there were fights, there were wars. So that's one of the myths, that we say there was no war, no bloodshed for Brazil's independence. And also that what today is Uruguay once was part of the Portuguese Empire, but became independent later as Uruguay and not as part of Brazil. Okay, any questions, any comments to this short video?
No, but I do find lots of the history very interesting. I will definitely have a look back at some of these videos because I feel like this is it's just
Yes.
new and very interesting.
I will make the website later available to you so you can go back and watch them again, okay? So the next video has an interesting title, is The King Who Declared Independence from Himself. Let's watch this. It's about Dom Pedro I.
Kids growing up and asserting their independence is a pretty normal part of life. Less normal is when they also assert the independence of their own sovereign empire. Dom Pedro de Alcântara Francisco Antonio João Carlos Xavier de Paula Miguel Rafael Joaquim José Gonzaga Pascual Cipriano Serafim de Bragança e Bourbon, or Pedro for short, spent only his youngest years in Portugal because when he was 9, Napoleon had set his sights on Lisbon, and the royal family was taking no chances with a man who had so far, to grossly oversimplify, declared war on all of Europe and won 4 times. And so they packed their things and moved to Brazil, and yes, I'm finally acknowledging the existence of South America, and it only took over 2 years and 22 videos. Sorry, Africa, you were this close. Growing up, Pedro actually got along well with his family, except for his mother, whom he lovingly called, quote, They gave him a fine education, but he was too hyperactive to make good use of it on his own and too spoiled to be forced to. But for some reason, he was really good at making other people calm down. Portugal and Brazil were both in the midst of liberal revolutions, and King João had to return to the mainland to go sign a constitution. But before he left, he told his son, hey, Brazil's probably gonna revolt soon. Better you take charge of it than someone else. Sure enough, one of the generals in Brazil staged a mutiny and came out with an army and a list of demands. But he hadn't counted on the fact that Pedro was already on the liberal side. He'd guaranteed property rights, released revolutionaries from prison, and when the army came to his door, he stepped out and negotiated a compromise. Meanwhile, the Portuguese parliament, which had recently called itself back into existence after a good century, decided that Brazil's time as a united kingdom was done, and it was pretty much going to be a colony again. As soon as he got the news, Pedro hopped on his horse and pulled a Braveheart, crying, "By my blood, we shall have independence or death, but hopefully independence." As wars go, it wasn't that exciting. Brazil bought ships and a few officers from Britain and chased off the Portuguese, but Portugal was only half the problem. A few territories weren't totally on board with the whole independence thing. The Secretary of State got fired for misconduct and started shouting conspiracy theories about Pedro being a dirty Portuguese traitor, so Pedro dissolved the assembly that was going to write the constitution and put a new group in charge. Then more territories broke off and declared independence from Brazil, but luckily for Pedro, they didn't have the backing of one of the most powerful empires on the planet. So Pedro finally gets his ducks in a row and his dad lets go of Brazil. Less than a year later, old João pegged out, and even though he had just declared war against Portugal, Pedro was officially its new king. To which he said, "Oh, no thank you, no." As hilarious as it would have been for him to keep the job, he handed the crown over to his daughter on the one small condition that she tie up any hereditary loose ends and to marry her uncle, because that would completely separate Portuguese and Brazilian interests. Unfortunately, much as he would have liked to think about Portuguese affairs, he had to worry about Uruguay declaring independence, which, as you might guess, was a war that didn't work out in Brazil's favor. Then his wife died, he broke up with his mistress, he couldn't get abolitionist policy passed through the General Assembly, and no matter what he did, he grew less and less popular. Meanwhile, his daughter had been ousted by his brother, son-in-law-to-be, who wanted to bring back absolute monarchy to Portugal. Well, one night when the streets were filled with protesters and his army and personal guard abandoned him, Pedro decided, fine, you know what? I'm going back to Portugal to help my daughter defeat her treacherous regent. Anyway, I'm leaving my 5-year-old son in charge under the care of a triumvirate of regents who will definitely not step over him and fight each other for power. Also, his guardian is the guy who has a track record of exiling political enemies and slandering me relentlessly. Take care. A few months later, Pedro shows up on the shores of Portugal with a small army of liberal allies who've all sworn not to shave until the queen is restored to power. And as soon as they land, they get besieged for over a year. Around the time the siege finally ends, a messenger comes from Brazil saying, "Hey, do you want to come back and at least be regent for your son?" Now, while this sounds like a great deal, Pedro figured that this was a way for certain restorationists to gain power, and chances were the whole empire didn't just change its mind overnight. So, ever the constitutionalist, he decided that he'd go back, but only if Parliament sent him an official petition. Well, not too much later, the Liberal army captures Lisbon and are stamping out the rest of the absolutist forces, razors in hand, when all of a sudden, the Prince of Spain, who just so happens to be taking power from his niece, decides to team up with Pedro's brother, and the war starts all over again. But after another year, Pedro and his allies prevail. And so the beard got trimmed just in time to make a pretty corpse, because he died 4 months later at the ripe old age of 35. Fun fact, in case you hadn't heard, that picture of the palace on fire was real. It's been the National Museum of Brazil since 1892, and 90% of everything in it was destroyed or severely damaged. There are, however, reconstruction efforts going on. If you've ever been and taken pictures, please consider uploading them to Wikimedia. I put some links in the description. Okay, have a nice day.
Okay, this one is a bit more on the humorous side, although it brings historic facts as well. There's another one on Dom Pedro here. Let's watch this one. Any questions? Any comments for now?
When you think of the Americas, I'm guessing that...
No?
When you think of the Americas, I'm guessing...
Okay, let's watch this one then.
The first thing that comes into your mind is not the word monarchy, but actually the continents have been home to a couple of them. Not counting the pre-Columbian ones, there was the Kingdom of Haiti during the 1810s, and Mexico was an empire on 2 different occasions during the 19th century. There was also the short-lived Kingdom of Araucania and Patagonia, proclaimed by a French lawyer, and finally there was the Empire of Brazil, lasting from 1822 till 1889, and founded by Pedro I, which is whom this video is about. But before we get to him, we need a bit of backstory. What is today Brazil had been claimed by the Portuguese crown in the year 1500, and grew to become the wealthiest and most important colony in their empire. And so when the Portuguese mainland was occupied by Napoleon's forces in 1807, the royal family decided to escape to Brazil and set up a court in Rio de Janeiro. During their 15-year stay there, the colony of Brazil was elevated to the rank of kingdom and enjoyed a large degree of autonomy. By 1820, however, the French troops had long since left the Portuguese mainland, and a liberal revolution broke out there, demanding the return of the royal family to Europe and the establishment of a constitutional monarchy. Thus, the following year, King John VI sailed for Portugal and left his eldest son Pedro as regent of Brazil. However, the revolutionaries back in Europe soon pushed to return the status of Brazil to being a colony. Thereby, Pedro was in practice demoted to merely being governor of the Rio de Janeiro province. But by then, the Brazilians had gotten used to having some degree of self-rule and did not intend to let go of it so easily. Therefore, when orders were sent demanding Pedro's return to Portugal, he, emboldened by the growing Brazilian opposition, decided to defy them. As a response to that, Portuguese troops in Rio de Janeiro mutinied and tried to persuade Pedro to leave by force. But with the support of militias and armed civilians, the troops were outnumbered and their mutiny was put down. By now, it had become more and more apparent that a final rupture with Portugal was inevitable. And so, in the following months, Pedro tried to uphold the semblance of unity with the mainland for as long as possible, while also going on a tour in the provinces to garner support. On his way back from Sao Paulo, the prince received news that the Portuguese parliament would not accept any self-governance for Brazil, and that anyone who disobeyed their orders were to be punished. After reading the letter, the prince mounted his horse and before his entourage held a speech, ending with the words "independence or death." On his 24th birthday, Pedro was proclaimed Emperor of Brazil, and 2 months later, in December of 1822, he was crowned in the old cathedral in Rio de Janeiro. But just because he now enjoyed the title of Emperor didn't mean that he actually had control over Brazil. All over the country, troops loyal to the Portuguese crown were still stationed, and it would take an additional 2 years of fighting until the last of them surrendered. Meanwhile, the Constituent and Legislative General Assembly had been elected for the purpose of drafting a constitution for the empire. But as one of its members started claiming the existence of a Portuguese conspiracy against Brazilian interests, and that citizens of Portuguese birth, including the emperor, were involved in it, Pedro I had ordered its dissolution in 1823. He then put the newly established Council of State in charge of composing a new constitutional draft, which was sent out to all town councils, where the vast majority voted in favor of it. There were, however, still those who objected against the centralized nature of the new constitution, and together rebels in the provinces of Ceará, Paraíba and Pernambuco attempted to secede from Brazil and form the Confederation of the Equator. But by the end of 1824, that rebellion had been put down. The country wouldn't be able to enjoy peace for long though, as just a few months later a small band of rebels backed by the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, later known as Argentina, declared Brazil's southernmost province of Cisplatina to be independent. In reality, the United Provinces expected to be able to annex Cisplatina, and so in response, Brazil declared war on them in 1825. In the ensuing conflict, no one would gain the upper hand, and it would end after a couple of years with the independence of Cisplatina as the Republic of Uruguay. But back in 1825, there had been some good developments as well, as Portugal finally decided to recognize Brazilian independence. However, a few months after that, Pedro received word that his father, King John VI, had died, thus making him the new King of Portugal. But since a reunion of the two countries would have been unacceptable, he soon announced his abdication of the Portuguese crown in favor of his eldest daughter, who would become Queen Maria II. Despite the abdication though, Pedro I would in many ways continue to act as absentee King of Portugal and interfere in the country's diplomatic and internal affairs. However, having to maintain his position as Emperor of Brazil, while simultaneously protecting his daughter's interest in Portugal, would prove a huge challenge for him. In 1828, 2 years into Maria's reign, the throne was seized by Pedro's brother, Miguel, who reinstated absolute monarchy. This, along with scandals and political opposition in Brazil, added to Pedro's growing will to leave the tedious life of a constitutional monarch behind, and instead go to Portugal, where he could fight for his daughter's rights, champion the oppressed, uphold liberty, and live a life of freedom and action that he seemed to have been better suited for. He would finally make the decision to abdicate after an incident in April of 1831. Unrest had recently broken out in the capital, following the harassment of Portuguese communities by street gangs. They had been incited by radicals within the Liberal Party, and on the 11th of March that year, the Portuguese had retaliated. The incapacity of the government to restore order had prompted Pedro to fire the Liberal cabinet. But upon doing that, a large crowd, also incited by the radicals, gathered in Rio de Janeiro and demanded the immediate restoration of the cabinet. Sometime after nightfall on the 6th of April, army troops, including his royal guard, deserted the emperor and joined the protesters. Realizing how detached from Brazilian affairs he had become, Pedro announced his abdication a couple of hours later. He then sailed for Europe and left his 5-year-old son, also named Pedro, as the new Emperor of Brazil. The following months, Pedro traveled back and forth between France and Great Britain in a failed attempt to gain their support. While in Paris, he did however befriend and receive the full moral support of the now aging Marquis of Lafayette, who famously fought in the American Revolutionary War. In January of 1832, he left Paris for the Azores, the last Portuguese territory loyal to his daughter. From there, he along with other prominent Portuguese liberals embarked for the mainland. 2 years later, he had successfully restored his daughter to the throne, but the war had taken its toll on Pedro and he was now dying of tuberculosis. During his illness, he wrote an open letter to the Brazilians, begging that they would adopt a gradual abolition of slavery, much like he had done with his estate in Santa Cruz. Pedro died on the 24th of September 1834, and according to his request, his heart was placed in a church in Porto, and his body was interred in the Pantheon of the House of Bragança.
Just as a curiosity, the heart of Dom Pedro I was transported to Brazil now for the 200 years commemoration of the 200 years of independence. So we still have it. As last thing for today, I'd like to have the independence, the Brazil independence, explained for gringos, as we call foreigners. So this guy is a foreigner himself, and he explains the Brazil independence for gringos. Let's watch this.
What's up, everyone? How are you doing today? Today is September 7th. September 7th in Brazil is the day that they celebrate their Independence Day. In the United States, we celebrate our Independence Day on the 4th of July. Basically, every country has a day where they celebrate their independence from a colonial power. Most of the time, independence from Britain. In this case, Brazil celebrates their independence from Portugal. Of course, the British were involved, as they are involved in almost everything. I will try to tell this story about how Brazil gained their independence from Portugal. It's a very interesting story, and it's a story very rarely told in English. So I will give it my best shot. I hope you like it. If you want to see more videos like this, I have a channel where I tell these kind of stories and travel vlogs and cultural commentary, a bunch of cool stuff. The link is in the description. I hope you check it out. Okay, where do I start this story of Brazilian independence? There are a lot of different places where I could start this story, but for the sake of time, let's start with Napoleon's invasion of Portugal in 1807. During the Napoleonic Wars, the Portuguese were allied with the British, and Napoleon, as you know, didn't like the British, so that kind of made Napoleon angry. He gave them an ultimatum like, stop hanging out with the British or we're gonna have beef. And they stuck with their historical BFFs. They were friends with the British always had their backs. So they're like, no, Napoleon, sorry. They didn't exactly stand up and fight, at least the court didn't. What they decided to do, the court, which was led by this pretty face right here, in Portuguese, his name is Dom João VI. In English, we would call him maybe John VI of Portugal. I think that would be the best translation. I will call him Dom João. I think it sounds a little bit better. He and his mother, who was still kind of in charge, but I think she was considered not mentally fit to run the country. So they left Lisbon, the capital of the Kingdom of Portugal, and they brought their whole court, bunch of people, bunch of stuff, to the colonial capital of Brazil, Rio de Janeiro. Little fun fact, Rio is no longer the capital of Brazil, it's Brasilia, but that's another story, another video. So the whole court ferried over by the British, so the British gave them safe passage, a favor of course they're gonna charge for later. The British don't do anything for free. So they brought the whole court to Rio de Janeiro. At the time, Rio's not the same Rio we think of now. Samba, all that stuff probably wasn't going on back then, and there wasn't too much development, as the Portuguese crown really didn't let the colonies do too much of their own development. They didn't really have any universities. Almost everyone went to university back in Portugal. Not everyone. The rich people with money went to University of Coimbra, I believe is the name. And basically there wasn't too much going on in Rio in terms of administration and buildings. So Dom João, he built a lot of the institutions. He built the botanical garden, a lot of different city planning and government planning, basically all the institutions a country needs, a new country needs. Portuguese crown gave that first attempt of nation building. Another thing that he did that was super important is that he opened up the ports. So in 1808, he opened up the ports to all friendly nations. Previously, Brazil could only trade with Portugal. He even made a special deal where England got a better trade deal than Portugal. I'm sure the Portuguese back at home fighting Napoleon really liked that little deal where their king left them to fight for themselves, and he gave the English a better trade deal because they helped him. So yeah, well, we could see this might cause problems down the road. Some people say independence started there when Don Juan arrived in Rio, opened up the ports. But eventually Napoleon was defeated and people started to want him to come home. Okay, you know, Napoleon is no longer here. Come back and run your country. And you know what? Brazil's a nice country, warm, beautiful beaches. He didn't want to leave. So he said, no, I'll stay. And in 1815, he upgraded Brazil from colonial status to a co-kingdom inside the Kingdom of Portugal. So it was the Kingdom of Portugal, Algarve, and Brazil. So it moved from colonial status to now it's actually its own kingdom inside, kind of like Scotland and England are two kingdoms inside the United Kingdom, something like that. I can't really get too much into that because I don't even know exactly all the details. But anyway, so now Brazil's their own kingdom. So once you're your own kingdom, you're not going to want to go back to colonial status. Of course, there are many different interest groups. Some Brazilian states want to be independent, and we see some independence movements during this time, especially in the state of Pernambuco. And actually, even before the king got there, we have independence conspiracy in Minas Gerais. But there's too much stuff to get into. Let's stick to the story of Dom João and his son Dom Pedro, who I will introduce now. Eventually, things get so bad in Portugal, there is a liberal rebellion, not liberal in the sense of liberal what we think of in the United States, but liberal as in they wanted their own corte, as they call it, which is a kind of a parliament, a Congress to make laws, and they wanted a constitution, they wanted free press, a lot of basic things that you would want if you were a country. And they're like, hey, someone come back here or it's going to get messy. Basically, this was what happened. I believe it started in Porto. Maybe no Porto because of their good fortified wine. But anyway, there was a big mess. And eventually, Dom João had to go back. And he left his son, 20-something-year-old Dom Pedro, or Don Peter, basically in charge. Of course, he's pretty young. He likes to have fun. He's not too serious. So there are more serious administrators that are kind of controlling him, but he is left in charge. And one of the things that the corte, the parliament, so to speak, wants is for Brazil to return to colonial status. So they start sending troops back. The English are kind of running the show a little bit. Dom João is kind of trying to hold on to some power, but I don't think he's doing a very good job. But basically the assembly, the corte, they want to take back control of Brazil. So they send troops to take back control. They also now want Dom Pedro, the son, to come back. But on January 9th, 1822, he says, okay, you want me to come back? Everybody wants me to come back. Guess what? I'm staying. Eu fico. Portuguese, eu fico. Literally, it's known as the day of the staying. Dia do fico. He decides to stay. And, you know, obviously that's going to ruffle some feathers back in Portugal. There are some minor skirmishes, but, you know, people are sizing each other up for a little bit. And then on this day, September 7th, he is headed to Sao Paulo. He actually was in Sao Paulo. He was visiting Sao Paulo to gather support for his cause, put down any chatter about revolution against the crown. You know, he's the crown, got the parliament, then you got your own separatist movements. So it's a big mess, pretty similar to basically every revolution that you will ever see. But on September 7th, he is going back to Rio from Sao Paulo, and he's by this little creek called Ipiranga. And he gets a letter, and basically the court, it's a letter from his wife, who's actually a Habsburg, Leopoldina, and his #1 minister, José Bonifácio. If you want to write that down, you don't have to remember that. But basically it's saying that the court doesn't respect you and you better come home or they're going to send more troops to mess you up. So come back now to Portugal or it's going to hit the fan. Things are going to get crazy. And you know what he says? He says, no, It's called the Cry of Ipiranga, the Grito de Ipiranga. It says, Independencia or morte, independence or death. This is what he declares, and this is the proclamation of independence. This is the official day that they celebrate, although there could be many different days, but this is the official holiday, and he's at this creek, and people say he was having stomach problems, so he was like basically having diarrhea all day, and he stopped at the creek to take a number 2. And when he was reading this letter, and I can't imagine how good that scream was if you have diarrhea, but he said independence or death. And actually the biggest retail gas chain, gas station in Brazil is called Ipiranga. So people still celebrate that. Ipiranga is a very important name. It's one of the first phrases of their national anthem and the gas chain. People make a joke now that the cry of Ipiranga is how expensive gas is, but that's another story. So I could cover a lot more things. This is really just the beginning. A lot of times people say that this was a bloodless war, that he just said, okay, Dad, you know, I'm not coming back. I'm staying here. And Dad was like, okay, son. This is not the case. There were many different fights between the Portuguese troops loyal to the Corte and Dom Pedro's troops, and also some separatist movements, states that wanted to start their own state. It wasn't nearly as bloody as the other wars in Latin America. When we think of Simon Bolivar, when we think of San Martin, Bernardo O'Higgins, those wars were much more, you know, deadly, much more. But it wasn't without bloodshed, and I'm kind of curious about the whole situation between the father and the son. There's a phrase that basically I'm paraphrasing, but the father says, Brazil's going to separate. I'd rather it be you than some crazy adventurer. So I don't know what the father actually felt about the son separating. 2 years later, Portugal would eventually recognize Brazil as an independent country after some fighting, mostly guerrilla fighting, no huge battles, but certainly there were some casualties. It took certain states longer to recognize Brazil's authority or Rio's authority. Actually, they lost one of their provinces called Cisplatina. Today, you would know it as Uruguay. In the vacuum left by the Spanish crown when the Spanish king had to abdicate during the Napoleonic Wars, Brazil took back the territory, which is now Uruguay. But when Brazil declared independence, Uruguay said, hey, we want to be independent too. And I guess in the end, England kind of liked that too, because then they could treat them as an independent country and get better trade deals. So they mediated the whole independence and treaties with Portugal, with Uruguay, with Argentina. So of course, the English were happy to see this new thing that they could take, they could get their hands on, you know? So the original imperialists, I know people like to blame Americans, and we do have our faults, but don't forget about the English. That was the quick little version about Brazilian independence. There are many more details that I
Okay, so I hope that those short videos were instructive for you and you learned a little bit more about the episode of independence of Brazil and what surrounded it before and after. So my hope is that you walk away today knowing a bit more. As I said, if you want, you can just visit and revisit those videos if you just go to my surname.net, as you see here, /Brazilian culture. You find down here a link on Brazil's independence, and that is what I showed here today. Okay? Any comments, any questions?
I would just beg you to could you kindly post the hyperlink in the chat, please?
Yes, I can do that. No problem. I can post it. Any other comments or questions? If not, so that's it for today. So next week we will be back to our usual Thursday session at 6 o'clock. I will let you know in the chat what the topic will be next week. So that's it for today. Thank you for being here, and happy Independence Day, Brazil. Feliz Dia da Independência. Bye-bye. Good night, all.
Ciao.